Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we unpack the latest AI research papers so you don't have to read them all yourself. Today, we're looking at a really interesting one: detect anything via next point prediction. It introduces a new model, Rex-Omni, a 3 billion parameter multimodal large language model. Seems like a big step for visual perception. Here's the 1-minute rundown.
Yeah, so the core challenge Rex-Omni tackles is the split we see in vision AI. You've got MLLMs,
Okay.
great with language, understanding complex stuff, but honestly pretty bad at knowing exactly where objects are. The geometry, the precision.
Right, they can talk about the picture but can't point accurately.
Exactly. And then you have traditional detectors like grounding dino, maybe. Super precise, but kind of rigid linguistically speaking. They don't get nuance. So Rex-Omni tries to bridge that gap. It unifies like over a dozen tasks detection, referring, pointing, even OCR and key pointing, all under one roof using coordinate prediction.
Okay, so how do they actually do that? Sounds like they need some clever tricks.
Two main things, really. First, how they frame the task. They use these special tokens, dedicated ones, just for coordinates. And these coordinates are quantized relative ones from 0 to 999. Makes it easier for the MLLM to handle.
Dedicated tokens. That avoids spelling out numbers with regular tokens?
Precisely. And the second big piece is the training, a two-stage process. You start with standard supervised fine-tuning, SFT, to learn the basics. But then they add this reinforcement learning step using something called GRPO.
GRPO.
Group-based policy optimization. It acts like a behavior coach for the model. It uses feedback based on the geometry, sequence-level feedback, to stop the MLLM from doing silly things like outputting the same bounding box 10 times.
Gotcha. So the key takeaway for you listening, whether you're a researcher or an engineer, is that this approach seems to get the best of both worlds. Good performance across different tests, especially shining on tasks that need language understanding, and it fixes some of those really annoying MLLM detection habits. It suggests MLLMs can finally handle geometry properly.
Yeah, that's the gist of it.
Okay, so let's dive deeper. We know the goal is combining language smarts with location smarts. But let's start at the beginning. Why do MLMs usually mess up localization so badly? You mentioned they treat coordinate prediction like classification with cross-entropy loss. Why is that such a problem for precision?
Well, think about it. Cross-entropy loss is designed for distinct categories. Is it a cat or a dog or a car? If the model predicts coordinate 33 when the answer is coordinate 34, CE loss doesn't see that as a tiny 1-pixel spatial error.
It sees it as completely wrong.
Yeah.
Like predicting dog instead of cat.
Exactly. It's a total misclassification of that token label. Geometrically, a 1-pixel difference is tiny, almost irrelevant sometimes. But for CE loss, the penalty is massive, disproportionately large. And that really stops the model from learning to make those tiny, fine-grained adjustments needed for pixel-level accuracy.
Right. So it punishes small geometric errors way too harshly.
Precisely. Whereas traditional detectors, they use losses like L1 or GIOU, which are built with geometry in mind. They understand that being off by 1 pixel is much better than being off by 50 pixels. They give smaller penalties for smaller spatial errors. MLLMs using standard CE just lack that built-in geometric intuition.
Okay, that makes sense. It's a fundamental mismatch between the loss function and the task. So Rex-Omni needed a different way. They went for direct coordinate prediction, keeping the MLLM structure simple, no extra modules bolted on. What was the specific format they landed on?
They went with relative coordinates represented by special tokens. So instead of absolute pixel values, they predict coordinates relative to something, probably the image boundaries or maybe a grid, and these are quantized, broken down into 1,000 discrete bins numbered 0 to 999.
Quantized, so it's still classification but constrained.
Kind of, yeah. It limits the vocabulary the model needs to learn for coordinates to just those 1,000 special tokens. Makes the learning problem much more manageable. And crucially, these are dedicated tokens only used for coordinates.
And that must be where the efficiency comes in, right? Using one special token instead of, say, 3 or 4 number tokens to represent 345.
Absolutely. The efficiency gain is pretty significant. Think about a bounding box. Xmin, Ymin, Xmax, Ymax. That's just 4 special tokens in Rex-Omni.
Wow.
Without them, if you were spelling out the numbers, it might take, 15 or more standard tokens.
Wow, okay, 4 versus 15.
Yeah. And imagine a scene with hundreds of objects. That difference adds up fast. Fewer tokens means faster generation, faster inference.
That's clever. And what I find really interesting is how they use this simple coordinate token sequence idea to handle all those different tasks you mentioned earlier, not just boxes, but pointing, key points. How does that work? Does the model just know what format to output?
Pretty much, yeah. It figures it out based on the text prompt you give it. If you say detect cars, it outputs sequences of 4 tokens for boxes. If you ask it to do pointing, maybe like point to the dog's nose, it outputs sequences of 2 tokens, the X and Y pairs.
And key points. That sounds more complex.
For key pointing, it actually outputs a structured JSON-like format within the token sequence. It might output the bounding box tokens, and then something like left eye, followed by the X tokens for the eye right ear, followed by its Lexi tokens, and so on. It's all generated as a single token stream, which is incredibly flexible.
That is versatile. And they mentioned input flexibility too. Visual prompting, what's that about?
All right, so besides just typing text prompts, you can actually give it an image and draw a box on it. Say you see some weird type of bird you don't know the name of. You draw a box around it and tell the model, detect all objects like this one.
Okay.
The model then takes the coordinates of the box you drew, converts those into the same 0 to 999 quantized tokens it uses for output, and uses that as part of the input prompt. It gives the model a direct visual special reference to understand what you mean by this one.
So it unifies language and visual pointing within the same token system. That's neat, something a classic detector definitely couldn't do internally.
Yeah.
Okay, so to make all this work, you obviously need a ton of data covering all these tasks.
Yeah.
How much data did they actually use?
It was. Yeah, a lot. They reported 22 million annotated images in total. That was a mix about 8.9 million from public data sets. But then a large chunk came from their own custom data generation engines.
Custom data engines.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack that, because they mentioned some interesting steps there. Like in the grounding data engine, they did something called phrase filtering, where they actually removed descriptive phrases like green lemon. That sounds backward for a language model. Why throw away descriptive language?
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive at first glance, right? But it was about ensuring the quality of the supervision. The problem is, generic grounding models, the kind you might use to automatically generate training data, often mess up with specific adjectives.
How so?
Well, if you ask a generic model to find a tall, thin tree, it might just find any tree, ignoring the tall, thin part. If you then use that incorrect grounding as training data, you're teaching your main model the wrong thing. You're introducing noise.
Okay. So by filtering out those tricky descriptive phrases before generating the grounding labels, they got cleaner, more reliable training signals, even if it meant simplifying the language slightly at that stage.
Exactly. Reducing annotation errors from potentially flaky upstream models. It's a pragmatic choice for cleaner data.
That makes sense. A subtle but important detail. And their referring data engine also sounded quite sophisticated, using multiple models together. Quen for generating descriptions, Molmo for predicting points, SAM for masks.
Yeah, they orchestrated a few specialist models to generate large-scale referring expression data, linking text descriptions to specific object masks via predicted points. And for the pointing data engine, they needed a good way to get single-point labels from existing bounding boxes or masks.
Right, how did they decide where the point should be? Just the center?
They used a more geometrically robust method. They found the minimum area rotated rectangle that encloses the object mask, then calculated the intersection of its diagonals. But crucially, they only used that point if it actually fell inside the object's segmentation mask. Okay, so not just the center of the box, but a point geometrically linked to the object's actual shape, verified by the mask. Clever.
Yeah, ensuring the point supervision was meaningful.
So all this data feeds into that two-stage training pipeline. Stage 1, supervised fine-tuning, SFT. You said this is about learning the basics.
Right. SFT is where the model just learns the fundamental skill of predicting those coordinate tokens. It uses standard cross-entropy loss on all 22 million samples across all the tasks. It's like the initial schooling, learn the vocabulary, learn the basic grammar of coordinate sequences.
But SFT has this teacher forcing issue you mentioned, where it never sees its own mistakes during training.
Exactly. During SFT, when predicting the next token, the model is always given the correct preceding tokens from the ground truth. It never has to generate a long sequence based on its own previous predictions.
And that leads to problems at inference time, when it does have to generate the whole sequence itself.
Yes. That's what they call behavioral regulation deficiency. Because it wasn't trained to handle its own potential errors or structure a long output sequence coherently, it can go off the rails during inference. It might repeat boxes, miss objects, generate weirdly structured outputs, all those classic MLLM detection flaws.
Okay, so SFT learns the what predicting coordinates, but not the how, predicting them well and coherently in sequence. Which brings us to stage 2, GRPO-based reinforcement post-training. You said this fixes the behavioral issues. How does GRPO, group-based policy optimization, work?
GRPO tackles the problem at the sequence level. Instead of just looking at one token prediction at a time like SFT, GRPO looks at the entire generated sequence of coordinates for, say, all detected objects. And it provides a reward based on how good that entire sequence is, geometrically speaking.
Sequence-level feedback, using geometry. What kind of rewards are we talking about?
They used 3 main geometry-aware rewards. First, a box IOU reward for detection tasks. This works kind of like an F1 score. It rewards finding the right objects, recall, not finding wrong ones, precision, and getting the box overlap, IOU, correct.
Okay, makes sense.
Second, for pointing tasks, they use a point and mask reward. This simply checks if the predicted point actually falls inside the ground truth object mask generated by SAM, ensures the point is relevant to the object's shape.
Simple but effective.
And third, a basic binary point-and-box reward used for things like GUI grounding, just checking if the predicted point falls anywhere within the target bounding box. These rewards give the model direct feedback on its actual geometric performance, teaching it to generate better, more reliable sequences overall.
Got it. So SFT learns the raw skill, GRPO refines the behavior and structure using sequence-level geometric feedback. Let's look at the results then. Did it actually work? How did Rex-Omni stack up on benchmarks like Cusio?
It did surprisingly well, actually. On Coco detection, in a zero-shot setting, Rex-Omni apparently achieved a better F1 score at the standard IOU 0.5 threshold compared to grounding Dino. That's pretty significant, showing an MLLM beating a specialized detector, at least when the overlap requirement isn't super strict.
So MLLMs can compete or even win if you don't need absolutely perfect box alignment.
Seems like it. Now, it's important to add the caveat. They still note that at the really strict IOU 0.95 threshold, the traditional regression-based detectors still have an edge. MLLMs aren't quite there yet for hyper-precision, but for many practical uses, IOU 0.5 is plenty good.
And what about those language-heavy tasks? LVIS, RefCocog. That's where you'd expect the MLM's language skills to shine.
And they did. Rex-Omni performed very competitively on those benchmarks. It shows the strength of the LLM component in handling long-tail distributions, lots of rare object categories in LVIS, and understanding complex natural language referring expressions like in RefCocog or human ref. Traditional detectors with simpler text encoders often struggle with that level of nuance.
Okay, but the real acid test you suggested was on those tricky data sets like Visdrone with lots of dense, tiny objects. That's where MLLMs usually fall apart. What happened there?
Right. Those data sets really highlighted the typical SFT failure modes. They saw 2 big ones: large box prediction, where the model just outputs a giant box covering most of the image, and the classic structured duplicate predictions spitting out the same box multiple times.
And this is where the GRPO validation comes in. They did a specific analysis to prove GRPO was fixing these behaviors, didn't they?
Yes, this is the really compelling part. They took the model trained only with SFT, ran it on Visdrone, and then manually removed all the duplicate bounding boxes from its output. Just cleaned it up post hoc.
Okay, and what happened to the score?
The performance, the F1 score at IOU 0.5, jumped by a massive 15.3%.
Wow, 15%, just from removing duplicates.
Yep. That clearly shows that duplicate generation wasn't just an annoyance. It was a major performance killer inherent to the SFT-only approach. The model was fundamentally prone to this bad behavior.
So the million-dollar question. How much did the GRPO-trained model improve when they did the same cleanup?
Almost nothing. The performance gain after manually removing duplicates from the GRPO model's output was marginal, like 0.1%.
Okay, that's night and day. 15% DS 0.1%.
Exactly. It's pretty strong evidence that the GRPO stage successfully taught the model not to generate those duplicates in the first place. It internalized the behavior regulation, making the post-processing cleanup unnecessary.
That's very convincing. Did they see a similar effect with the large box problem?
They did. On the dense 200 dataset, the SFT-only model generated those useless, huge boxes covering 95% of the image and about 20.5% of the samples. After GRPO training, that failure mode dropped dramatically, occurring in only 3.5% of predictions.
So the big takeaway on GRPO is less about boosting raw coordinate precision. SFT already got it most of the way there, and more about enforcing good behavior, ensuring the model outputs sensible, non-repetitive, correctly structured predictions.
That seems to be the key benefit, yes. It's about improving the reliability and the likelihood of sampling a correct, well-formed sequence of detections. SFT learns the notes, GRPO teaches the rhythm and phrasing.
Makes sense. Okay, one last crucial point. Efficiency. We talked about the token savings using special tokens. Rex-Omni needed only about 7.6 tokens per box on Kessico versus almost 150 for some other MLM methods. That sounds way faster.
The token generation is much faster per box, definitely. But there's still a fundamental bottleneck with these autoregressive MLLMs.
Okay.
The generation time scales linearly with the output length, and the output length scales linearly with the number of objects detected. So if you have a really dense scene with hundreds of objects...
The output sequence gets incredibly long, even with special tokens.
Exactly. Generating that super long sequence token by token still takes time. They mentioned that detecting hundreds of objects could take over 16 seconds, even on a powerful A100 GPU.
Oof. Okay, so while it's more token efficient per box, it's not necessarily faster overall than a highly optimized parallel detector for really high throughput scenarios yet.
That seems to be the case currently. The sequential nature of MLLM generation is still a speed limit compared to detectors that can predict all boxes in parallel.
All right, so let's wrap this up. Rex-Omni looks like a significant step. It really does seem to bridge that gap between language understanding and geometric precision in a unified model. They showed MLLMs can handle diverse perception tasks accurately by using smart coordinate quantization and, crucially, that GRPO reinforcement learning stage to fix the behavioral issues.
Yeah, I think it strongly suggests that MLLMs aren't just going to be limited to language or simple vision tasks. They have the potential to become the foundation for truly general-purpose visual perception systems, especially for tasks needing that complex reasoning, like interacting with GUIs or spatial pointing based on natural language.
Absolutely. Which leads to a final thought for you, our listeners. Given that the main remaining bottleneck seems to be inference speed, particularly that linear scaling with the number of objects detected, what specific acceleration techniques do you think will be most critical for making these powerful MLLM-based perception systems practical for real-time high-throughput applications, things like robotics, or maybe analyzing fast-moving video feeds? The paper mentions ideas like quantization or distillation. What's your bet on the key to unlocking real-time MLLM perception? Something to chew on after this deep dive.